Hey class, this is GriffinHood. Today I'll be going over the Think Aloud method using the book The Boys in the Boat by Daniel James Brown. Here's the problem. Students just aren't remembering what they read. A lot of times when students are reading, they often will drift off just because they're just not entertained by the text. So then they absolutely forget what they're reading as they continue to go along, or they're struggling to understand what they're reading. They're getting bogged down in what you would call the decoding of the text. So they're trying to figure out what vocabulary words mean or who this character is, and they can't connect their prior knowledge to the text. And therefore they're getting stuck in this and not grasping the overall plot of what is actually happening, which is damaging their comprehension of the text. Alright, so what are we going to do about it? How are we going to help find a solution? The Think Aloud is a technique in which students verbalize their thoughts as they read and thus bring into the open the strategies they're using to understand a text. The purpose of it is to monitor comprehension, to promote direct thinking. Essentially, a student should be thinking the entire time that they're reading, and that way they can use different methods that they've learned and figured out what it is they do and don't know about the text. This keeps them constantly engaged in what they're reading. There's several studies that have shown students who verbalize their reading strategies, meaning they think out loud as they read and then clearly create thoughts while reading, score significantly higher on comprehension tests. But the students also need to be aware of the many different comprehension methods and use different ones as they're reading in order to retain the information better. So then students should also be constantly thinking while they're reading. In doing so, they can be aware if they are not receiving the information as well as they should be, then they can change the comprehension method that they're using. This keeps them further engaged on the text and moving along and retaining more information. There are some specific things that students should be thinking about and considering while they're reading. Some of those may be what they notice or information that may be important. Facts about the story or the character. Predictions, what they think is going to happen based on their prior knowledge of everything that they've already read. Questions they have about the characters, vocabulary especially, or the setting. Personal reactions, how they feel about the character did or said, or how it relates to them. It's very important that they make a personal connection to the text. The more they're able to do that and relate it to their own lives, the more engaged they're going to be on what they're reading. Okay, so I know it may be a little confusing, but aloud doesn't necessarily mean out loud. Take this text for example. When you're reading, you have thoughts about the text, the information that you're bringing in. So in white will be the passage that you would be reading, and in red are my actual thoughts. So this would be the first step of the process, getting your thoughts down next to what you're reading in order for you to have the information to talk about. So I would have the passage, like the one on the previous slide, written down on a handout for the students to go over. I would explain that this is how that we need to work through the process. You're reading, and as you're reading, you're jotting down your notes for us to talk about afterwards. So then I would have them pair up. Using this method, they would go through the next couple of paragraphs, write their thoughts, any questions they may have, and then discuss with each other the questions and thoughts that they came up with. They can learn from one another, maybe things that they missed, or create an open discussion about the topic at hand, where they think the story's going, who they think this person is, and that sort of thing. The class will then openly discuss together what they wrote down. A lot of the students might be surprised. They have the same notes as other people in the class, and they may hear things that they didn't think about to begin with. The students will then practice to think aloud alone, maybe be given a homework assignment. A perfect result would end in a student-led question and answer session the following day based on their own notes from the reading. So they would learn from each other things that they missed, things that they caught, and the teacher would be a guide to flow them in the theme that the class is trying to follow. Now I'm going to talk about applying the Think Aloud method using The Boys in the Boat by Daniel James Brown. Out of the depths of the Depression comes this improbable, intimate account of how 9 working-class boys from the American West showed the world at the 1936 Olympics in Berlin what true grit really meant. I chose this text for a couple of reasons. It has historical relevance, especially with the 2016 Olympics vastly approaching. It has a lot of struggles and strife in it that I believe that students today can go through, including finding where you belong in life. Working together is a good team building exercise that they can see how these guys had to work together as one unit to achieve their goals. The importance of teaching is high in this, that the guys had to listen to their coaches. They had to be moldable. They had to be willing to be taught this sport that they knew nothing about. And then overcoming large odds. I think that's a large thing that people go through today in life is just they sometimes don't want to try because they don't think that they can overcome what's ahead of them. But if they can see examples of other people overcoming similar situations, then that can give them hope. This book follows the accounts of the 1936 men's Olympic rowing team that competed in a Nazi-run Berlin. It's set against the backdrop of the Great Depression and follows the story of Joe Rance. Joe was the son of a working-class father struggling to find his place in the world. He looked to join the University of Washington's rowing team as a way to better his status. The author weaves between Joe as a freshman at the University of Washington and his much beleaguered childhood. This method gives the reader a clear visual of the struggles Joe faced growing up and how he used those struggles to better prepare him for the obstacles he would face. Joe, along with 150 or so other freshmen, most of similar blue-collar backgrounds as he was, found themselves in unfamiliar territory. They'd never been in a rowboat. They didn't know how to row. And this sport was normally set aside for the upper echelon of society. They depended on sheer determination to get them through the grueling tryout process. Joe's childhood is told in sort of a flashback style. The early chapters take time to show what life was like for him growing up. And trust me, it wasn't easy. His mother died when he was 5. So then he was sent to live with his aunt across the country in Pennsylvania because his dad, grieving, went on a walkabout in Canada. Then he contracted red fever and was quarantined in his aunt's attic. He didn't see anybody for weeks at a time. They brought him food and essentially just figured at some point in time he was going to die. But he didn't. He got better, and then he moved back to Washington and in with his older brother and his new wife. Well, his father shows back up and then marries the twin sister of his older brother's wife. Then Joe moved in with them. Well, his stepmother Tula didn't care for him too much and kicked him out of the house when he was 10. He moved back in when he was 11, and the family moved to a new town. Then, when he was 15, the Great Depression hit. Joe's father, his wife Tula, and the other children packed up and left Joe to fend for himself. So although the stories are interwoven, if you consider it as halves, the second half of the book follows the University of Washington's rowing team and all those involved in getting to the 1936 Olympics. It shows in great detail how events in history line up. People are put in places, and the decisions we make ultimately lead to a decisive outcome. The man that built the boats, George Pocock, for example, started out in Great Britain. His father was a shipbuilder. His brother was a boat builder. Him and his brother traveled to Vancouver to try to find work, and then they were brought down to the University of Washington by the prior coach in order to build shells and build a better team for the University of Washington. He ended up building shells for not only them, but for universities across the entire country. The coach, Al Ulbrichtson, was a former rower at the university and one of the youngest coaches in the history of the sport at only 32 years old. The 9 boys from varying backgrounds all had their own path in making it into the team. It took overwhelming odds and a complete team effort to achieve their ultimate goals. The University of Washington's 8-oar crew was never supposed to defeat the elite teams of the East Coast and Great Britain, yet they did, going on to shock the world, coming from behind to defeat the Germans rowing for Adolf Hitler. This comes from the Alabama Course of Study Standards for Social Sciences, 11th grade. Describes social and economic conditions from the 1920s through the Great Depression regarding factors leading to a deepening crisis, including the collapse of the farming economy and the stock market crash of 1929. Much of Joe's childhood is set against this background, and you see just the insurmountable odds that the average American went through on a daily basis just in order to survive. The substandards are analyzing the Great Depression for its impact on the American family. It goes into this in great detail, especially in regards to Joe and his family and the struggles that they went through. For the English language arts section, I want to analyze a complex set of ideas or sequence of events and explain how specific individuals, ideas, or events interact and develop over the course of the text. This is especially vivid in the fact that this is a historical document, and you see how these different figures had to come together in order for this event to take place. And then analyze and evaluate the effectiveness of the structure an author uses. Like I talked about, there's the interweaving, you jump back and forth between Joe at college and then showing Joe as a child. His or her exposition or argument, including whether the structure makes points clear, convincing, and engaging. This is how I would imagine a class would go in using this method through this book. First, I would read a paragraph in the book as the class followed along. Then, I would show them the paragraph with my thoughts written down throughout by the way of a handout, much like we saw in an earlier slide from a random paragraph. We would then discuss my thoughts out loud. I would ask who in the class had the same questions as they followed the text. Then the students would pair up to read the next couple of paragraphs. They would repeat the process, writing down their thoughts. Then quietly discuss their thoughts with one another. Then we would discuss everyone's thoughts as an entire class. Try to answer any questions and make sure that everybody fully understands the process they should be using when they're going through the paragraph. The students could see who had similar thoughts and discover new things they may not have thought about. The students would then be given a section to read for homework. They would use the method so the following day we could discuss together as a class. If all goes well, we would be able to use just the thoughts, the questions, and the discussion points that the students came up together in order to talk about them as a class and make sure that everybody has an equal comprehension of the text that we read. The great thing is that you can format this method to fit any theme the class is going to be focusing on. Just make sure that your students know the direction in which you want them thinking when they're reading the text. This excerpt from the book could be used for focusing on family life during the Great Depression. My thoughts on red, so you could read the paragraph to the class out loud and then stop to insert your thoughts. Then late one rainy afternoon in November, the school bus dropped Joe just as darkness was enveloping the house. Okay, so the author's using ominous wording. Something must be about to happen that's bad. Walking up the driveway to the house, stepping over potholes full of rainwater, Joe noticed his father's Franklin, its engine running, plumes of white exhaust billowing from the tailpipe. This must not have been a common occurrence. Yep, Joe knows something's wrong. Something was tied to the roof of the car, with a tarpaulin over it. Tarpaulin. Is that the long form of tarp? Huh. Maybe they're moving. Let's see. As he drew nearer, he saw that the younger kids were sitting in the back seat among suitcases and peering out at him through steamy windows. Tula was sitting in the front seat, staring straight ahead, looking at the house, where Harry stood on the front porch, watching Joe approach. Joe mounted the porch steps. His father's face was drawn and white. This doesn't look good. Yep, old Tula, she's finally getting her way. They're leaving without Joe. So this way, the class can see how their thought process should be constantly going throughout reading as they're pulling little bits of information or any other questions they may have about the text as they read along. All right, math teachers, I've read in some of the comments that y'all are struggling to maybe see how these methods could be used in a math class, so I tried to do a little bit of a research to see how you guys could apply this method. So it can be used in a math class, not only just for word problems, but the student would take the problem and think aloud, step by step, of how to solve it. So here's a quick example. So if you had 5x plus 7 equals 27, so your inner thought would be, I need to get x by itself. The first thing I should do is subtract 7 from each side. Okay, so that leaves me with 5x equals 20. Now, to get that 5 out of there, I can't subtract it, so what do? The 5x, well, that means 5 multiplied by x. So to get rid of a multiplier, I have to divide. So divide both sides by 5. All right, now I get x equals 4. So let me check that. 5 multiplied by 4 is 20. Now add 20 plus 7, and I get 27. So that's how the think aloud method should be used in the math class, or at least one way. All right, let's wrap this up. So in closing, think aloud causes the student to constantly think about the text while they're reading. This is keeping them more engaged, because they're constantly thinking about each little detail. Think aloud can reveal a lot about a student's prior knowledge. If they are mainly asking vocabulary questions, then there's a really good chance they're not comprehending the text. They're not thinking about the plot or the characters. They're too worried about what the words mean. Think aloud puts the power in the student's hands. Once they get a good grasp on it, their questions will become deeper and more enriched as they think more about what they're reading. They can use these questions in an open discussion with their peers to speak further about what they've read and to gain different points of view and maybe a better understanding or how somebody else sees the text at hand. So I used a journal article called Using the Think Aloud for Reading Instruction by Leslie Oster. It can be found in the Reading Teacher journal. It's about a 7-page document. It has a lot of really useful information and different ways that the Think Aloud method can be used within the classroom. The Course of Study Standards came from the ALEX website, found here, alex.state.us. And then if you want to give it a read, order the book. I do know that there's 5 or 6 copies in the local libraries in Baldwin County. I got mine from Barnes & Noble, but it's a great quick read. Thanks.